He said, "She won't notice." And the worst part wasn't the theft itself. It was the certainty in his voice, the quiet confidence that his grandmother had finally grown so faded and forgettable that even $40 and a lottery stub could vanish from my purse without my mind registering the loss. I remember that sentence the way some people remember the moment a doctor says a terrible diagnosis, as if the walls around you tilt by a few degrees and the room becomes too small for air. I wasn't meant to hear it. I had come down the hallway quietly, carrying a basket of laundry, the kind of chore I still insisted on doing myself because I was terrified that once I stopped, I'd never get it back. My grandson's voice floated out of the kitchen, low and dismissive, tinged with that new tone he'd acquired in the last few years, the tone of a young man who believed he'd outgrown everyone, especially me. And then he laughed, that careless little huff of amusement that made something old and fragile inside my chest settle into a shape I didn't yet recognize. I think a part of me, some naive, stubborn, foolish corner, still wanted to believe that he was joking, or that he didn't mean it the way it sounded. But the truth was already there, standing quietly between us, like a cold draft seeping through a cracked window. I'm 82, though in my family that number has become an argument rather than a fact. My daughter likes to round it up when she tells stories. Mom's almost 90. She shouldn't strain herself. And my grandson rounds it down when it suits him. She's only in her early 80s. Stop worrying. She can handle it. I suppose that's the only real sign of aging that mattered in that house. Not my bones or my memory, not my slow hands or my quiet steps, but the way my age could be stretched and shrunk to fit whatever narrative made things easier for them. I live alone now, not because I wanted to, but because the alternative was slowly dissolving into the background of someone else's life, like a photograph left too long in the sun. My house is small, with thin walls and old floors that sigh when I move across them, but it is mine, and the silence inside it doesn't demand explanations or apologies. But back then, at the moment he stole that ticket, I was still spending afternoons in my daughter's kitchen, folding towels and mending little tears in the clothes nobody else bothered to fix. I told myself it made me useful, that it kept me from becoming a burden, though deep down I think I feared the day I'd be seen as nothing but one. On the day it happened, I had brought over a small tin of lemon cookies that I'd baked the night before, a recipe my own mother had taught me when I was no older than my grandson is now. Baking always made me feel anchored, like the smell of butter and sugar melting together could pull me back into myself. I'd set the tin on the counter, next to the pile of mail my daughter hadn't sorted yet, and reached into my purse to tuck away my wallet when I noticed the little envelope where I always kept my lottery tickets. I'm not a gambler. I buy a ticket once a week, not because I expect anything, but because it gives me a small spark of childish possibility, a momentary what-if that makes the world feel a little less settled, a little less predictable. The slip was gone. The envelope, normally stiff and slightly overfilled, felt too light between my fingers. I told myself I must have misplaced it, maybe dropped it in the car, or left it on my dresser. I didn't want to think anything else. Not yet. Not when the room smelled of fresh coffee and my daughter was humming to herself at the sink. But then I heard the shuffle of feet, the clink of a spoon, and that voice, the voice that still sounded like the toddler who once climbed into my lap with sticky hands and asked if I could read him just one more story. "She won't notice," he said, so casually, so confidently, and then a chuckle, the kind people use when they've already decided that the person they're talking about is too small, too slow, too lost to defend themselves. In that moment, the air thickened, and I stood still, holding the laundry basket against my stomach like a shield. staring at the faded pattern of the wallpaper as if it could tell me what to do. I didn't confront him right then. I don't think I even breathed for a while. I just stood there, letting the weight of what I'd heard settle into the small, aching spaces between my ribs. It wasn't the money, not really. God knows I've lived through poorer days than most people can imagine. It was the certainty, the way he knew I wouldn't be believed, the way he counted on my silence, my confusion, my softness. That was the thing that hurt the most. Not the theft, but the assumption that I would swallow it quietly, the way I had swallowed so many things in my life. Disappointments, dismissals, little wounds delivered with smiles. When my daughter turned and saw me standing there, she smiled, that polished smile she'd perfected over the years, the one that never quite reached her eyes. "Mom, you scared me," she said lightly, wiping her hands on a towel. She didn't notice the look on my face. Or maybe she did and chose not to name it. I think people often choose blindness when truth becomes inconvenient. I murmured something about taking the towels to the guest room wash basket and walked away before my voice could tremble. My grandson brushed past me in the hallway, smelling of cologne and impatience, and didn't look at me. His shoulder hit mine. He didn't apologize. In my room, I sat on the edge of the neatly made bed and breathed through the dull, slow burn in my chest. I took out my phone, a small, old thing with a cracked case, and opened the photo gallery. There it was, a picture I had taken 2 days earlier of the lottery ticket, not for any dramatic reason, just because I photograph all important papers ever since the time I lost my insurance card and spent 3 days searching for it. The numbers stared back at me, clear and sharp, and I whispered them aloud without meaning to, like a prayer or a curse. I didn't know yet what those numbers meant. That revelation would come later, with the force of a storm breaking through a quiet sky. At that moment, the only thing I knew was that something had shifted inside me. Something small but irreversible, like a hairline crack in a porcelain cup. I remember placing my hand against my sternum, feeling the slow, steady thud of my heart. I'm old, yes, but not vanished. Not yet. And as I sat there, listening to the muffled sounds of my daughter's household, the television humming, the water running, my grandson laughing as if nothing in the world could touch him, I felt a strange calm settle over me, a calm I hadn't felt in years, maybe decades, a calm that whispered quietly but firmly, "You noticed, and that is where everything begins." The moment everything tilted from discomfort into something unmistakably sharp happened 2 days later, long after I had convinced myself that perhaps I had misunderstood what I had heard, long after I told myself that my grandson's voice must have carried in some strange way, or that maybe he was talking about something else entirely, something trivial, something not worth wounding myself over. People my age become experts at doubting our own perceptions, as if time itself erodes not only our bones and balance, but also our right to believe what our senses tell us. I wanted to be wrong so badly that I spent those 48 hours moving through my daughter's house as quietly as a shadow, observing without acknowledging, listening without reacting, hoping that somewhere between the coffee mugs and the afternoon sunlight I would find proof that my family still saw me as a person and not as an obstacle or a convenient blur. But the truth has a way of insisting, even when we try to muffle it. It was a Tuesday morning, the kind where the sky seems too pale and thin, the kind where you can feel the shift of something coming before you know what it is. My daughter had gone to work early, and my grandson was supposed to be at his part-time job, but he hadn't left yet. I found him in the kitchen, leaning over the counter, his phone open to a web page I didn't recognize. His face was lit not with the usual bored detachment I'd grown accustomed to, but with something sharper, anticipation, maybe, or hunger. When he heard my footsteps, he snapped the phone face down with an awkward swiftness, the kind of movement that betrays more than it conceals. I asked gently if everything was all right, and he gave me a smile that didn't belong on his young face, a smile too familiar, too reminiscent of the expressions I used to see on adults who thought children couldn't interpret their motives. "Fine," he said, "just checking something." The words were harmless, but the tone was not. There was a tremor of excitement beneath the surface, something restless and bright that didn't match the stillness of the room. I felt a flicker in my stomach, that sense of being a step behind in a conversation whose context is deliberately hidden from you. I busied myself with rinsing a teacup, pretending not to notice the tension in the air, until I caught, out of the corner of my eye, the edge of the lottery results webpage glowing faintly beneath his palm. I don't know what compelled me to reach for the old envelope in my purse later that morning. Maybe a whisper of intuition, or maybe just a desire to feel anchored in something real. I slipped into the small guest bathroom, locked the door behind me, and opened my purse on the edge of the sink. The envelope with my weekly lottery tickets lay there, thin and lifeless, with only the older, losing stubs inside. The one from Saturday, the one I had photographed, was still missing. I stared at the envelope, feeling an old, heavy quietness settle in my bones, a quietness that felt like resignation at first, but then curdled into something sturdier. I took out my phone, opened the photo of the ticket, and typed the numbers into the results page. Maybe there are moments in life when the world pauses to let a truth sink in, when the air around you becomes so still that even your heartbeat feels too loud. That is what happened when the screen refreshed and the numbers aligned perfectly, digit by digit, with the ones on my photo. I didn't scream. I didn't gasp. I didn't even sit down. I just stared at the glowing confirmation, the jackpot amount printed in bold, as if mocking the quiet space I was standing in, and felt the room shift. $34 million, enough to erase debts, to change lives, to tempt even the kindest soul, enough to make a greedy one reckless. I knew then that it wasn't just theft, not just a careless act of entitlement. It was premeditated, calculated, built on the assumption that I wouldn't notice, that I wouldn't check, that I wouldn't know how to verify anything. He had taken the ticket because he believed I was too forgetful or fragile to trace it, and he had checked the numbers before I did, probably before dawn, standing over the counter with the soft blue glow of victory on his face. I imagined him rehearsing what he would say once the news broke, inventing a story about buying the ticket himself, maybe claiming he found it on the ground, maybe lying outright without a flicker of guilt, because why should he feel any? In his mind, I was already fading into the margins of my own life. When I came out of the bathroom, the house felt colder, though nothing had changed except my clarity. My grandson was gone, leaving behind his half-finished bowl of cereal and the lingering echo of a boy who no longer saw me as anything but a convenient weakness. I walked to the window and watched the street for a while, watching the cars pass, trying to breathe normally, trying to understand how a single slip of paper could reveal so much truth about a family I thought I knew. When my daughter returned home hours later, I almost told her, almost held up the photo and asked her to look me in the eyes and tell me what she believed was happening. But when she walked into the kitchen, she was distracted by work emails and grocery bags and the small, nervous energy she always carried these days. She kissed my cheek absently and said, "Mom, don't worry about little things. Everything's fine." Everything was not fine. Everything had finally become unmistakably, irreversibly wrong. That night, I lay awake listening to the sounds of their house, feeling the ache of a truth too sharp to swallow. It wasn't the money that kept me awake, though the number kept flashing across my mind like a neon sign. What kept me awake was the realization that I was alone in this, alone with my knowledge, alone with the undeniable evidence that the people I loved most believed I had become someone they could deceive without consequence. And somewhere between midnight and dawn, as the house settled into its nighttime breathing, I understood that this was no longer about a ticket or even about betrayal. It was the moment I woke up to the fact that my life, quietly and without ceremony, had crossed a threshold from which I could not go back. I suppose the real unraveling didn't begin with shouting or accusations or any dramatic confrontation, but with the small, deliberate quietness that settled into the corners of the house like dust, the kind that gathers slowly and then all at once becomes undeniable. After discovering the truth about the ticket, I didn't confront my grandson or my daughter, not out of fear, but out of a strange, suspended clarity, as if I were watching the life around me from a few steps to the left of my own body, observing how people behaved when they thought the world was unfolding exactly the way they expected. I moved more carefully through their rooms, noticing things I had ignored before, like how quickly my grandson hid his phone when I entered a space, or how my daughter's voice shifted into a slightly sharper tone whenever I mentioned misplacing something or forgetting anything minor, as if she were unconsciously building a case for my fragility. These weren't new behaviors, but now they pulsed with a different meaning, illuminated by the knowledge of what had been taken from me and how confidently they believed I wouldn't know. The morning after I checked the numbers, I entered the kitchen and found my daughter and grandson speaking in low voices. Their conversation stopped instantly, replaced by that too bright, too smooth politeness that family members use when they're hiding something and convincing themselves the secrecy is for your own good. My daughter handed me a cup of tea before I could ask for one, and told me she had arranged for someone from the clinic to call me later about scheduling a routine cognitive screening, a phrase she delivered so casually that I knew she had rehearsed. I asked why, keeping my voice calm, and she responded with a soft sigh that wasn't unkind but was deeply patronizing, telling me that at my age it was standard, and that some little lapses lately had made her think it was best to get ahead of things. The tea was too sweet, a detail I noticed because she knew I never added sugar, yet she had prepared it for me as if I were a guest instead of someone who had raised her. My grandson sat at the counter scrolling through his phone, his shoulders stiffening when I looked at him. He didn't meet my eyes. He told me, in a tone too casual to be honest, that he would be gone most of the day, that he had errands and plans and things to take care of. And when I asked lightly whether those things included stopping by the gas station where he had found or bought or inherited my ticket, he froze for the smallest fraction of a second. Then he laughed, a short, loud sound that didn't match his expression, and made some comment about me being funny today. He left the house quickly afterward, but not before grabbing his jacket with a hurried, tense motion that suggested he didn't want to be in the same room with me long enough for me to ask even one more question. That afternoon was the first time I felt the shift from confusion and shock into something more quietly frightening. My daughter hovered, offering help I hadn't requested, checking whether I'd eaten, asking if I needed a nap, as if she were trying to guide me into a role I had not agreed to play. When I told her I intended to walk to the market, something I'd done countless times, she placed a hand on my arm and said gently that maybe I should rest, that I'd seemed scattered lately, that it might be safer to wait until she or my grandson could accompany me. Her tone was soft, but her fingers curled just slightly too tight around my sleeve. the way someone holds onto a fragile object they think might slip and shatter if not handled carefully. I pulled my arm away, politely, and assured her that I was perfectly fine. But she followed me to the door and reminded me to lock it carefully, reminding me as if I were a child. When I returned, she was sorting my mail on the table, opening envelopes without asking, making piles that she labeled aloud, bills, ads, things you don't need to worry about. And I stood there watching her, realizing that somewhere along the way, the boundary between us had shifted without my noticing. I asked her gently not to open my mail without permission, and she smiled that strained, brittle smile that doesn't reach the eyes, telling me she was only trying to help, insisting it was better if she handled anything complicated. I wanted to ask what exactly she thought I was incapable of now, reading, thinking, existing, but I didn't. Instead, I watched her tuck a piece of mail aside with a motion too quick to be innocent, a motion she assumed I hadn't noticed. Later, I found that envelope in the trash, crumpled beneath a grocery receipt. It was addressed to me with a return address from the State Lottery Commission, a generic mailer, nothing dramatic, but its presence in the trash told me everything. She had opened it, seen something she didn't want me to see, and then tried to hide the evidence. When I smoothed the envelope out on my lap, I felt my hands trembling, not from age, but from the dawning understanding that this wasn't only my grandson's betrayal anymore. It was becoming a family project built on the assumption that I was too confused, too worn down, too diminished to follow a trail of small but deliberate actions. In the evenings, the atmosphere in the house grew stranger, thickening with the unstated knowledge that something had shifted. My grandson stayed in his room with the door closed, speaking in hushed tones on the phone, lowering his voice whenever I passed by. Once, I overheard him say, "She won't fight it," his voice dripping with certainty, and though I didn't know what the "it" referred to, I knew it was related to the ticket. My daughter, meanwhile, began suggesting that it might be time to consider giving her temporary access to my financial accounts, telling me that managing everything alone must be stressful and that she only wanted to lighten my burden. She said she had spoken to a friend who knew about elder care, and I felt a cold knot tighten in my chest. When I asked who the friend was, she changed the subject. Each small evasion was carefully wrapped in concern, but the threads of control were visible, thin but unmistakable. At night, lying in the guest room that never truly felt like mine, I could hear their footsteps outside my door, hear my grandson's laugh in the living room, hear the clinking of glasses and the opening of drawers. Once, I heard them whispering, my daughter's voice low and urgent, his sharp and defensive, and the words, "She'll come around, and don't push her yet," floated through the thin wall. They thought I was sleeping. They thought I was unaware. They thought my silence was submission. But silence can be a kind of witnessing, a quiet gathering of strength. The strangest part of that week was the growing sensation that they were waiting for something, waiting for me to break, to forget, to give in to the narrative they were slowly weaving around me. They watched me too closely, smiled too deliberately, spoke too gently with words that felt like cotton stuffed into my ears. My grandson avoided my gaze entirely, which told me more than any confession could. My daughter hummed while she cooked, her hands moving mechanically, as if distracting herself from the weight of what she was helping to conceal. And I began, slowly and deliberately, to collect things, tiny details that might have seemed meaningless to them, but were beginning to form a pattern in my mind. I wrote notes on scraps of paper and tucked them into my pocket. I photographed mail and text messages. I kept copies of documents they thought I would discard. With every small act of preservation, something steadied inside me, like a pendulum finding its center. I wasn't preparing for battle. I was preparing to be believed, if not by them, then by someone who still recognized that age does not erase truth. The first escalation wasn't loud. It wasn't violent. It was the soft, relentless tightening of control, the slow erasure of my autonomy, and the unspoken expectation that I would disappear into confusion while they shaped the future around my silence. But I did not disappear. I noticed everything, every whispered plan, every edited truth, every patronizing smile. And though I said nothing aloud, a quiet resolve began to take form in me, stronger than anything I had felt in years, a resolve that whispered through the walls of that house like a promise. I see what you are doing, and I am not done yet. Heaviness has a way of settling into the body so gradually that you don't feel its full weight until something lifts it, even for a moment, and the sudden lightness nearly knocks you off balance. That is what happened the morning I walked out of my daughter's house with the excuse of getting some fresh air, though the truth was far simpler and far more urgent. I needed to think somewhere they couldn't watch me. The walls of that house had begun to feel like ears, and every word I said, even the harmless ones, echoed back at me with suspicion. I walked slowly, careful not to give them any reason to claim I was unstable. But once I turned the corner and their windows were out of sight, I felt my steps loosen, felt my breath slip back into a natural rhythm. I followed the long pavement toward the small public library I had visited years ago, a little brick building with peeling paint and a ramp that creaked under your feet. I wasn't going there for books. I was going because I remembered a sign I'd once seen on the bulletin board inside, something about free legal assistance for seniors on Tuesdays and Fridays. It was Friday. I don't believe in divine timing, but I do believe in recognizing a door when it cracks open. Inside, the library smelled of dust, paper, and the kind of gentle neglect that happens in buildings run by people who care deeply but are perpetually underfunded. The place was nearly empty except for a librarian shelving returns, with the slowness of someone who had been on her feet too long. When I approached the bulletin board, I saw the flyer, creased at the corners, curling from age, but still legible enough to make my pulse quicken. Free legal consultation for seniors. No appointment necessary. Fridays 10 a.m., 1 p.m. It was 11:07. For a moment I hesitated, hearing my daughter's voice in my mind, cautioning me about complicated things and suggesting someone else handle it. But that hesitation lasted only a breath. In a back room partitioned by a flimsy accordion divider sat a young attorney at a metal folding table, hair slightly messy, tie loose, surrounded by stacks of pamphlets about wills, tenant rights, and elder fraud. He looked up with the tired politeness of someone who had listened to too many long stories that morning and motioned for me to sit. I did, gripping my purse a little too tightly. I expected to feel foolish explaining everything, expected him to interrupt or smile condescendingly, expected him to assume I was confused or exaggerating. Instead, after I quietly described the missing ticket, the photograph, the family behavior that followed, and the tense silence of the last few days, he didn't smile at all. He leaned forward, folded his hands, and asked in a steady, measured voice if I still had the photo. When I showed it to him, he examined it with the seriousness someone might give to a medical scan. Then he asked if anyone else had access to my belongings. I nodded. He asked if I had reason to believe my grandson might have taken the ticket. I nodded again, this time slower, the admission pressing against my chest. He didn't dismiss me, didn't patronize me, didn't offer platitudes about family misunderstandings. Instead, he said something simple and devastating. If what you've told me is accurate, you're the legal owner of a lottery ticket that was unlawfully taken. That's theft. Potentially grand theft, depending on the state statutes. Hearing the words spoken plainly, without sentimental cushioning, without the quiet gaslighting I'd grown accustomed to at home, felt like a window thrown open in a long shuttered room. I didn't realize I was holding my breath until I exhaled, shaky and long. He asked if I wanted to make a report. I told him I wasn't ready yet, that I needed to think, that I wanted to understand what the process would look like. He explained everything with careful clarity, how the lottery commission tracks purchases and redemptions, how surveillance footage at the store could confirm the buyer, how the commission refuses payouts if ownership is disputed, how filing a report would freeze any attempt to cash the ticket. With each sentence he spoke, the narrative my family had tried to weave around me, one of confusion, fragility, and imagined lapses, began to unravel. My mind felt clearer than it had in weeks, perhaps months. There was no chaos in me, no trembling, just a steady, growing sense of orientation, like turning slowly toward the sun after a long season of being kept indoors. He placed a card in front of me, not pushing it into my hand, but setting it gently, giving me the choice. "You're not alone in this," he said. Those 5 words reached into a place deep inside me where a different truth had been building quietly. I had become accustomed to being alone, to being doubted, to being softened into silence. Hearing that I wasn't, that I didn't have to handle this entire burden without support, felt like someone pouring warm water into my cupped palms, reminding me what it feels like to be treated with basic dignity. On the walk back to my daughter's house, I moved more slowly, not out of fatigue, but because everything looked different. The trees lining the street seemed sharper, the air cooler, the ground firmer beneath my feet. I realized how long I had been walking on eggshells, flinching at shadows of imagined weakness. The legal advice hadn't solved anything yet, hadn't returned the ticket or exposed the lies circulating in the house, but it had given me something far more valuable. I had my footing back. The fog that my family had relied on, encouraged even, had thinned. When I entered the house, I found my daughter standing at the kitchen counter, flipping through the mail again. She looked up with a mixture of surprise and irritation, as if she didn't expect me to return without calling her for help. Her eyes dropped immediately to my purse, scanning it with a reflexive suspicion I recognized now as guilt disguised as concern. She asked where I had gone. I told her only that I had taken a walk and stepped into the library for a bit. Her face tightened almost imperceptibly. She said she wished I'd told her. She'd been worried. The word hovered in the air like a net. I didn't walk into it. My grandson came home later with the kind of tense energy people carry when they're waiting for verification of something monumental. He kept checking his phone, pacing lightly, leaving and re-entering rooms without purpose. When he finally sat, he avoided looking at me in a way that wasn't casual avoidance. It was the kind of avoidance someone shows the person who unknowingly holds the power to destroy their plan. I observed him quietly, thinking of how, just days ago, I would have interpreted his restlessness as youthful impatience. Now I recognized the sheen of fear behind it. Dinner passed in an awkward, brittle silence. My daughter talked too much, filling the air with stories about colleagues, about renovations in the neighborhood, about the rising price of groceries, anything to keep the conversation far from the ticket neither of them believed I could prove was mine. Every so often her voice trailed off, and she would glance in my direction, searching my expression for cracks. I offered none, but the real shift, the true midpoint of everything, was internal. It wasn't a confrontation or a declaration. It was a realization that the version of me they depended on, the one who apologized for inconveniences she didn't cause, who let others interpret her forgetfulness or exhaustion as proof of decline, no longer existed. Something steadier had taken her place, someone who had finally stepped outside their expectations long enough to see them clearly, someone who understood that the truth was not fragile, that age did not make me invisible, and that silence did not make me powerless. That night, alone in the guest room, I took the lawyer's card from my purse and held it between my fingers. I wasn't ready to make the call yet, not because of fear, but because I understood now that timing was its own kind of weapon. I would wait, watch, and gather what I needed. I would be deliberate in a way my family never imagined I could be. They had underestimated me so profoundly that they mistook their own wishes for reality. And in that quiet room, with the window slightly open and the sound of distant traffic drifting in, I realized something that made my breath steady and my hands stop trembling. The part of me that had spent years shrinking to fit inside their expectations had finally expanded back to its full shape. Not loud, not vengeful, just whole. I had thought that clarity would bring peace, that once I understood exactly what had been taken from me and how deliberately it had been done, the worst of the storm would pass, and I would simply need to follow the path toward justice, step by step. But clarity does not bring peace when the people around you are invested in keeping you in the shadows they built. And within days, I began to feel a different kind of tension in the house, one made not of secrets, but of strategy. My daughter and grandson were no longer simply hiding something from me. They were preparing for something, adjusting their behavior in small, almost imperceptible ways, as though they were aligning themselves for an inevitable impact. Their worry was not for me, but for the consequences of what I might do. It started with small gestures that at first seemed like overcompensation. My daughter began packing lunches for me, placing them in neat containers in the fridge, even though I hadn't asked for such a thing in years. She offered to drive me wherever I needed to go, insisting that the weather was unpredictable or my knees must be bothering me, a line she repeated so many times that it lost all pretense of sincerity. She hovered behind me in the kitchen, watching me handle knives or boiling water, her eyes flicking with subtle panic as though she imagined disaster at every turn. She spoke to me in softened tones, the way adults speak to children or to fragile animals, as if gentleness could erase the fear tightening around her spine. But the most telling change came in how she monitored my time. She asked where I was going, for how long, and with whom, as if I had become a confused elder who might wander into danger at any moment. My grandson grew more restless. He stopped leaving his phone unattended and kept his bedroom door closed for hours at a time. When I knocked gently once to ask if he wanted tea, he opened the door only a crack, thanked me quickly, and closed it before I could see inside. He avoided lingering in the same room with me for too long, yet I often caught him watching me from the corner of his eye, studying my movements as though trying to predict a pattern he feared. Once I found him rifling through the drawer of the hall table, where I sometimes kept my keys and notepad. When he noticed me behind him, he startled badly enough that the drawer slammed shut, and he mumbled something about looking for a pen. It was a lie delivered clumsily, and his face betrayed a flicker of embarrassment. But more importantly, it betrayed fear. Not for me, for himself. Then came the day my daughter announced, in a strained voice that tried and failed to sound casual, that she had scheduled a family meeting for that evening, something we had never done before in our lives. The words hung between us like damp fabric, heavy and uncomfortable, and though she framed it as an opportunity to check in with each other, I saw the tremor in her hands as she stirred the soup on the stove. My grandson came home early that afternoon. his eyes sharp and nervous, and he spent the hours leading up to dinner, pacing from room to room, tapping his fingers against his thigh, glancing repeatedly at the clock. Their behavior was not the behavior of people preparing for a conversation. It was the behavior of people preparing for confrontation. When we finally sat at the table, the silence was so thick I could feel it against my skin. My daughter cleared her throat, folded her hands too neatly, and began with a speech about how things in the family have felt tense lately, and how she worried I had been feeling overwhelmed, a phrase so rehearsed and technically precise that I recognized it immediately as something she had been advised to say by someone else. She talked about aging, about stress, about memory. She talked around the truth in wide circles, never touching it, but building a web of implications that all led to one idea, that I was not capable of handling my own life without their careful supervision. My grandson stared at his plate, jaw tight, saying nothing until she nudged him with her foot under the table. When he finally spoke, his voice was strained and brittle. He said he had been worried about me, that he had noticed I seemed confused lately, that he thought maybe I needed help organizing things. The irony nearly made me laugh, but I kept my face still, my hands quiet in my lap. He insisted he was only trying to look out for me, that he didn't want me getting taken advantage of, a phrase that would have been laughable if it hadn't been spoken with genuine fear threading through his voice. And then the true purpose of the meeting emerged. My daughter slid a folder across the table, filled with papers she hoped I wouldn't understand. She said they were just precautionary documents, meant to help her assist me with my finances and decisions if things ever became difficult. She spoke of doctors, of legal responsibilities, of protecting me from mistakes. She spoke like someone preparing to lead a lamb into a pen. She didn't think I would read the papers closely. She didn't expect me to notice the clauses that would grant her full access to my accounts and decision-making power over my property. She didn't expect me to realize the forms were not standard, but crafted carefully, with legal jargon chosen to obscure their true intention. She didn't expect me to see the trap, but I did. I saw every line. I saw the quiet desperation behind her smile. I saw the trembling in my grandson's hand as he reached for his water glass. I saw the fear that they might lose control of something they believed was already theirs. I looked at them both calmly, thanked them for their concern, and told them I would take my time reviewing the documents. My daughter tried to insist I sign them that night, citing urgency and convenience, but I stood slowly, pushed my chair back, and said, with a firmness I hadn't used in years, that I would not be pressured or rushed. The air in the room changed visibly. My grandson's expression hardened, his fear shifting into irritation. My daughter inhaled sharply, forcing a smile that strained the edges of her composure. They exchanged a quick look, a silent conversation passing between them that they thought I couldn't interpret. But I saw it clearly, the dawning realization that I was not as pliable as they had hoped. Over the next few days, their subtle pressure became more overt. They suggested I stop driving, suggested I give them copies of my house keys for emergencies, suggested I let them set up automatic bill payments through their accounts to help me. My daughter grew sharper, snapping at small things, and my grandson became resentful, slamming doors and retreating to his room whenever I entered a space. They were unraveling faster than they could hide it. Then came the moment I knew the situation had escalated beyond deception into open manipulation. I received a call from a clinic I had never visited, telling me that they had an appointment scheduled for me at my daughter's request, a cognitive evaluation set for the following week. I asked who authorized it. They gave my daughter's name. I asked what symptoms had been reported. They read a list that felt like a twisted parody of my own life: forgetfulness, confusion, moments of disorientation, inability to remember conversations, signs of early cognitive decline. My daughter had said all those things about me, and she had said them with confidence. It was a lie designed to create an official record, a foundation for something larger, something legal, something dangerous. I hung up the phone and sat in silence, my hands steady even though everything inside me was shaking. I realized then that the situation had moved beyond the stolen ticket. It had become a battle for control, and they were willing to rewrite my mind to win it. They would paint me as confused, incompetent, unable to manage my own affairs. And once that narrative gained a foothold, the truth wouldn't matter. That night, I moved through the house quietly, watching the two of them sit together on the couch, whispering again, their faces tight with fear and calculation. They had no idea that I had already spoken to a lawyer, no idea that I had copies of everything, no idea that I had begun making plans of my own. They still believed I was drifting gently toward the role they had chosen for me. But something had changed inside me so profoundly that I would never fit back into that role again. I had crossed into a space they could no longer control, and though they sensed it vaguely, they didn't understand the full scope of it yet. Their fear made them reckless. Their recklessness made them cruel. And all of it, the pressure, the manipulation, the plans made behind closed doors, only confirmed what I already knew. They believed I was powerless. They believed I had no one. They believed I wouldn't fight. They were wrong. There comes a moment when the balance inside a person shifts so completely that even fear loses its shape, and what had once felt like a looming presence becomes no more than a shadow cast on the floor. That moment arrived for me the morning I walked into the quiet, sun-washed office of the State Lottery Commission with my purse clasped firmly against my side and every piece of evidence I possessed tucked neatly inside it. I had not told my daughter where I was going. I had left before sunrise, stepping out of the house without the careful creaking of the floorboards they had learned to listen for, and I drove myself across town in a calm that felt almost unreal. My hands did not shake. My breath did not stutter. There was a clarity inside me so sharp it felt like light. The lobby of the commission building was nearly empty, its outdated chairs and humming fluorescent lights giving the place a sense of deliberate simplicity. The woman at the reception desk asked how she could help me, and when I explained quietly that I believed a winning ticket belonging to me had been stolen and possibly misrepresented, she did not laugh or question my sanity. She asked to see my identification, asked if I had any documentation, and when I handed her the photograph of my ticket, she frowned with seriousness rather than doubt. She called someone from the back, and within minutes, I was seated across from a claims investigator with graying temples and kind but cautious eyes. He listened to my story without interrupting, taking notes with the slow, steady movements of someone accustomed to separating truth from confusion. When I finished, he asked if I remembered where I had purchased the ticket, and when I named the convenience store, he typed something into his computer and nodded thoughtfully. He informed me that the store had standard surveillance footage for the dates in question, and that any claim on the winning ticket would already have triggered an internal review. Then he said something that made my pulse quicken. A redemption attempt was made this week, not by you. He didn't say my grandson's name because I hadn't said it aloud, but he didn't need to. The truth was already laid bare between us. He asked if I was able to confirm that the person who attempted to redeem the ticket was a relative. I nodded once and placed on the table the neatly folded papers I had brought, screenshots of my messages with my daughter, notes of dates and behaviors, a list of what had gone missing and when. Everything I had observed with the meticulousness of someone who refuses to have her truth erased again. He looked through the document slowly, and when he finally raised his eyes, I saw the shift in him, the moment he recognized that this was no misunderstanding, no moment of elderly confusion, but a deliberate betrayal. The investigator stepped out of the room after that, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I stared at the muted painting on the wall, an uninspired watercolor of a coastline, and listened to the faint hum of printers and phones in the back offices. I did not feel triumphant or vindicated. I felt something quieter and far deeper, the sense of a weighted cloak slowly slipping off my shoulders after years of being told it belonged there. When he returned, he carried a folder and a sober expression. He explained that the attempted redemption had been frozen pending verification precisely because the signature on the back of the ticket did not match the ID submitted. They had been waiting for someone to come forward with a legitimate claim. "You did the right thing by coming," he said gently. "We take theft very seriously, especially theft from vulnerable individuals." I almost laughed at the word vulnerable, but I let it pass. Then came the part I had been preparing myself for, but still felt surreal as it unfolded. He informed me that law enforcement would need to be involved because of the dollar amount. A crime of this size could not be handled privately or quietly. I nodded, accepting this, and within the hour I found myself speaking to a detective who approached the situation with the professionalism of someone who had seen too much of the world's unkindness to be surprised by familial betrayal. He asked me questions, took copies of my evidence, and assured me that the investigation would proceed quickly. When I handed him the photo of the ticket, he studied it carefully, then asked if I had shown it to anyone before today. "Only myself," I said, "and now you." By the time I walked out of the building, the sky had shifted from pale morning gray to the golden warmth of midday. I stood on the sidewalk for a long moment, letting the sunlight touch my face, feeling the strange, steadying sensation of having acted decisively, irrevocably. The world did not crumble. The sky did not fall. I had done what needed to be done, and for the first time in weeks, I felt the full shape of myself again. When I returned to my daughter's house, the atmosphere was immediately wrong. My grandson was standing in the kitchen, shoulders tight, phone gripped in his hand as if it were a lifeline. My daughter hovered behind him, pale and frantic, her expression shifting the moment she saw me. They had received calls, voicemails from the Lottery Commission, missed calls from an unknown number, messages they hadn't dared to open. Their panic filled the room like smoke. My grandson demanded to know where I had been. He spoke too loudly, too quickly, as if volume could mask the tremor in his voice. When I didn't answer right away, he stepped closer, his eyes sharp with a fear he couldn't hide anymore. My daughter tried to pull him back, but he shook her off, insisting that I owed them an explanation. For a moment, the air between us felt dangerous, charged with all the emotions they had been stuffing behind polite facades. I set my purse on the table, removed my coat slowly, and looked at them both with a calmness that came from some place they no longer had access to. I told them I had visited the Lottery Commission. I told them I had reported the theft. I told them the claim was frozen and would be investigated. My daughter's face drained of color. My grandson's mouth twisted into something between anger and disbelief, as if he couldn't fathom that I had acted without their permission, without their knowledge, without their control. He began talking quickly, desperately, insisting he had meant to sort things out, insisting that there had been some confusion, insisting that he had been planning to talk to me first. But lies unravel easily under the weight of truth, and the truth was now bigger than any excuse he could fabricate. When he realized that his words weren't landing, He shifted tactics, accusing me of betrayal, of turning against my own family, of letting outsiders meddle in private affairs. My daughter backed him, tearful and frantic, pleading with me to reconsider, to undo whatever I had set in motion, to think about the consequences. I listened to them quietly, letting their panic wash over me like cold water, steadying me rather than shaking me. I realized then that they weren't distraught over hurting me. They were distraught over losing control of something they had convinced themselves they deserved. When their words finally ran out, I picked up my purse and told them I would be leaving. Not visiting, leaving, for good. My grandson's eyes widened in disbelief, my daughter's in horror, but neither one reached for me or tried to follow. Perhaps they thought I was bluffing. Perhaps they still believed I would fold under emotional pressure, but they no longer knew me. I walked out the front door with the quiet certainty of someone stepping across a threshold into her own life again. And as I drove away, the road stretching before me in a clear, unbroken line, I felt no regret, only relief, only a strange, tender kind of triumph. Because the irreversible had happened. I had reclaimed not the ticket, not the money, but myself. There is a particular kind of quiet that arrives only after a storm you've spent years pretending wasn't there. A quiet that doesn't feel like emptiness, but like the slow unfolding of air in a room you finally opened after keeping it shut for too long. That is the quiet I found myself in weeks after leaving my daughter's house. Settling into the small lakeside cottage I rented with the help of an old acquaintance who didn't ask many questions and didn't bat an eye when I arrived with only 2 suitcases and a folder of legal documents. The cottage was nothing grand, but it held a stillness that felt like truth. The light poured differently through its windows, softer yet clearer, and in the mornings I would sit by the water with a mug of tea, feeling the warmth seep into my palms, as though reminding me that I was, in fact, still here and still whole. The investigation moved forward without me needing to prod it. The detective called occasionally, his voice steady and professional, updating me on procedures I didn't pretend to fully understand, but trusted, because for the first time in a long time, someone else was doing the work of protecting my rights. Instead of erasing them, there were interviews, verifications, legal statements, and eventually the acknowledgement from the commission that the ticket was undeniably mine. They said the words almost casually, as if naming the owner of a life-changing sum of money were an ordinary matter. But when I hung up the phone that day, I sat for a long time, staring out at the rippling surface of the lake, not feeling victorious or elated, but simply steady. My daughter tried to call me afterwards. She left voicemails layered with apologies and explanations, none of them honest, all of them shaped by fear of consequences rather than remorse. She spoke of misunderstandings, of confusion, of wanting to repair the family, but her voice held none of the softness a true apology requires. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. My grandson never called. I suppose pride and dread tangled too tightly inside him to allow for even a single word, and that was fine. I wasn't waiting for any. People like to imagine that justice arrives with fanfare or relief, but what I found instead was a kind of gentle recalibration, as though the world had tilted slightly back into alignment after being skewed for years. I spent my days in small rituals, tending to the few plants on the windowsill, learning the quiet rhythms of the birds that gathered on the railing, reading old novels I once loved and had forgotten. With the settlement finally processed and the funds placed securely in my name, I allowed myself small luxuries, not extravagances, but symbols. a thick wool coat that wrapped around me like a private sanctuary, a wooden table carved by a local craftsman whose hands shook slightly, but still knew how to coax beauty from simplicity, a quilt from a woman who lived on the far side of the lake, stitched in colors that reminded me of early dawns. And in the evenings, when the light thinned and the world slowed, I would sit in the quiet and reflect on how easily a person can lose themselves without ever noticing, how easily love can be twisted into obligation, and how deeply dangerous it is. When others convince you that your own voice is unreliable, I thought of all the women my age who lived inside houses where their names were spoken only in tones of impatience or false concern, women who were slowly made invisible by people who claimed to care for them. I understood them in a way I hadn't before. Sometimes, as I walked along the lake path, I would pass other elderly women, some with walkers, some with small dogs, some moving slowly with the kind of deliberate grace that comes from age rather than frailty. And I began to see something I had been blind to for years. We are not as fragile as people believe, and the world is full of quiet rebellions no one notices. A woman refusing to hand over her checkbook, a grandmother locking her door at night even when told not to worry, an old friend insisting on reading her own medical forms before signing them. These were acts of survival, of resistance, of dignity. I am not naive. I know my story could have ended differently. I know that many women in my position have been pushed into silence or institutions or legal oblivion. I know that I was lucky to have the strength to recognize the truth before it swallowed me. But I also know this: the moment I stopped apologizing for existing, the moment I stopped letting others define the edges of my reality, the world opened in a way I hadn't felt since I was young. One evening, standing on the cottage's small porch, watching the sun fall behind the trees in a slow, warm blur, I whispered something to the empty air, a message to women I would never meet, women sitting quietly in living rooms where no one hears their voice anymore. I said it softly, but with a conviction that vibrated like a vow. You are not invisible. You are not mistaken. And you are allowed to take back what is yours, even if it's only your own name. The lake carried the word somewhere I will never see, and that was enough.